Hi church, this is section 5 of our ACT series. Welcome back. We've been learning from the writer Luke what Jesus has been doing. He left 2,000 years ago, but what's he been at? And the clear answer, which I hope is becoming really precious to us, is that he is very involved in the life of his church and the building of his church. We've seen last week how this church covered now the whole area, the eastern side of the Roman Empire, which is that Jesus has been calling out souls from all the dark corners, people who've been chosen before the beginning of the world, the foundations of the earth. And this has been wonderful to see. It's a bit like that shepherd going out and finding the lost sheep and bringing them back to the fold. Well, not only have we been seeing, as Luke been teaching us, what Jesus is doing in building his church, he's also showing us what we are. We are the church. He's teaching us by showing us the early days, what it is like to be the church. We've been looking at different elements, and this section we arrive at element 5, which is leadership. Very briefly, or basically, there are leaders in the church. There are leaders and there are followers, and this is God's appointment. We will also see, though, what leadership is like what are those leaders like. And what's been a blessing to me as I've been preparing is I got to see in the attitude of these leaders, how they persevered, how they cared for the church, how they took initiative and followed through and were driven. I got to see in their attitude Jesus' attitude towards the church, how Jesus views us and how much he cares. And I trust that will be a blessing to you as you spend the time in these chapters in this section. Now, the chapters we're talking about, we've moved right up to chapter 18, and then this section will cover chapter 19 through to the end of 21. Okay, since this is a kickoff video, let me get to the little chart where I can give you an overview of the chapters, which hopefully keeps in mind the bigger picture as you read each day. This is the part of the chart that we've got to, chapter 19 through to 21. We've covered so far the beginnings where the church was established in Jerusalem. It faced trials, it pushed through them, it was strengthened by the exercise. And then it transitioned to becoming a church not simply centered in Jerusalem and comprised of Jewish people, but a worldwide church comprising all sorts of people on the earth. And it's covered, as we said, the whole eastern side of the Roman Empire. And that's what we covered in the last section. Now we get to chapter 19, and there are a number of strange stories. And it's, as always it's important to ask ourselves, why is Luke choosing to tell us these stories? There's the stories of the sons of Sceva running away naked from a demon-possessed man. You have this group of 12 disciples who were probably the beginnings of Apollos' ministry in the area. You have the riot caused by the silversmiths. What is Luke teaching us? Now, my understanding, I think, is that he's trying to show us that Asia, this last area of the eastern side of the Roman Empire, is becoming saturated with ministry. That there is an established church, there is an ongoing, well-known ministry of the gospel there. And I think this is what Paul recognizes after spending 3 years there in Ephesus, longer than anywhere else. And this is what Luke also wants us to see, that here Paul then determines, okay, this area is saturated, this whole area of the Eastern Roman Empire has had an established church in it now. It's time to see new areas, sighting new ground. It's time to move on. But Paul doesn't just up and leave. He makes sure that he leaves behind a church that is worthy and knows what it's about and is well connected. And so these 3 chapters, I've entitled them Sighting New Ground and Leaving Churches Behind. It is very much about the ministry of the Apostle Paul. In leaving the churches behind, he takes time to teach the Ephesian elders, and Luke takes time to record that teaching. And also he's moving back up through Macedonia and stopping in all those local churches and spending time there. I mean, he preaches all night in Troas, but he brings with him representatives from these churches as well, and money to take them to the Jewish church in Jerusalem. So again, that he's constantly working to make sure this Jewish church in Jerusalem is connected and one with the Gentile church. So they don't rely on him connecting them all, because as I said, he's leaving. And so he makes sure that the churches are strengthened as he looks to the next frontier. As we briefly look at this green line where we've been plotting the big picture overview of how Jesus is building his church. As we've said, Asia is now the last area of the Roman Empire saturated. The next step is Rome. That new ground is Rome. And he's going back to Jerusalem in order to be sent to Rome. And as we find out in his letter to the Romans, he wants them to send him to Spain. And so we know that the Spirit has determined that he will get to Rome, and we know he will. And in the process, he actually gets to minister to the kings, to leaders, to sailors, to everyone in the process. And so that's what we're going to see more towards in the final section of our study. We see his leadership as we talk about what it is to be the church. We see his leadership in these areas, not just his own insight, but how he trains up the other leaders. I'll leave that to your own study, and I leave just this big picture idea of sighting new ground and leaving behind churches. Okay, additional to our chart, here is the map that we've been looking at as we've charted Paul's journeys. Things began way back in Jerusalem in chapters 1 to 6. We moved up to Antioch, and from there started 3 missionary journeys. In the green, the first one to Asia Minor. In the blue, we've moved across over to Macedonia and Achaia. And in the red journey, the third journey, we've made it as far as Ephesus in chapter 18, beginning of 19. And this is the third journey of Paul. Here he spends 3 years ministering until all of Ephesus, all of Asia has heard the word. The churches at the beginning of Revelation are ministered to or planted at this time. But he moves up from Ephesus then to Troas. He wants to end up back in Jerusalem, and he makes his trip to Jerusalem via the churches in this area in order to strengthen them, as is his way. So he moves up somehow to Troas. From there he goes, as we said, across to Macedonia, no doubt moving down through the churches, and ends up in Corinth. He spends 3 months here. This is where he is teaching he writes the epistle to the Romans. And from there he intends to take a ship back. Now he discovers a plot of the Jews to kill him, and so instead he moves back up via the route that he's taken through the churches in Macedonia. My map is getting very messy now. Ends up back at Troas. Here he spends that whole night teaching, and poor Eutychus falls out of the 3rd floor window. This is where then Paul moves on down this coastline and stops just off the coast at Ephesus at the island of Miletus. And he's saying goodbye to people at every time along this journey, and it's here at Miletus where he gives that final exhortation to those elders before taking the ship on through, passing through Rhodes and heading back up over to Tyre. Again, he takes the time that's necessary for the ship to be unloaded to go out and intentionally meet and find the local congregation there. And just like everywhere else, they're warning him of what's happening, what's waiting for him in Jerusalem. But he presses on, knowing that this is what God has called him to. And he moves on down to Caesarea. This is where we meet up again with Philip from chapter 6. And from there, he ends up at the end of this 3rd journey in Jerusalem. And this is going to be his launching pad to Rome. Let me wrap up this video as we usually have, looking at our focus passage. This is our condensed text that really, in a short amount of verses, puts forward very clearly the focus that Luke is wanting us to see. And that, in this section, is leadership, I believe. And so it's no surprise, we're turning to chapter 20 for our focus passage. And this is Paul's talk to this group of Ephesian leaders, elders in the church there. And I would say right off the bat, it's kind of difficult to lead particularly small children through a passage where it's just like a monologue or a sermon sometimes, or even for ourselves as we read it. We can move too quickly over such passages and not really fully grasp what's happening and what are the consequences and then the emphasis. So for that purpose, what I've done is I broke down the text for you just to kick off your study, and I've done it into 3 sections, and it forms a bit like a sandwich. 2 pieces of bread and a piece of meat in the middle. The 2 pieces of bread we'll see are quite similar, and the meat in the middle is the core point of the issue. Verses 17 and 21 and 31 to 38 are our pieces of bread, and verses 22 to 30 is that core issue. So let's look here first of all. Paul is commanding these elders now that they have to take care of God's church, to look after themselves and the flock in which the Holy Spirit has placed them. They're to look after God's church. And he gives this picture of sheep with wolves, and that which sort of should help us understand the emphasis and the perilous nature of the situation. But he also gives them two bad pieces of news almost. He says, I'm leaving you. I've been there and I've been leading this work 3 years, but now you're on your own because I'm going and you're not going to see me again. And the second piece of bad news is there are wolves. You can expect them. And so how do these leaders, these Ephesians leaders now face this issue, this responsibility to take care of God's church when they're on their own and they know wolves are coming? And that's when we can turn to our two pieces of bread, which sandwich this central issue. And in both of them, Paul says, look at my example. He lays out how he has approached his priorities in the ministry that he's had with them and his practices. Both the cases, he just look to me and what I've done and how I've approached it. And we're going to see they're quite similar. So the first one, up in 17 to 21, he talks about how he has selflessly served them. Humility and tears, that's a deep concern that he's had as he served his Lord by serving them. Secondly, he's continued to teach them through this. He's not held back on the gospel, regardless of who he was teaching, Jews or Gentiles. And you're going to see this really reflected in verses 31 to 38, where he lays out how he has continually admonished them and encourages them also to their own study of the word. And that word ministry obviously reflects the continual teaching. And then finally he exhorts them to not be after to what they can get from the church in terms of money or position, but instead to work hard, so not to be a burden on the weak. And that reflects very well the selfless service. And so just to sum up, these elders, as they're to look at this calling of Jesus to look after his church, they're to consider that word ministry is something that they have to maintain, absolutely necessary, and they're to do so with a selfless service. They're not to lord it over, but to follow their master Jesus ultimately in serving and giving, rather looking to give rather than looking to profit from. So I hope that's laid out the passage for you. I hope it's helpful. The only other thing I would say is that when we come to a passage like this, particularly if you're not an elder or a leader in the church, or even it's easy to look at these things that are 2,000 years old and say that that's not really applicable for us. But the reality is that this is very applicable to all of us, elders or not, that God's church needs taken care of, because not only do they need fed, they need protecting from bad teaching. So this, I think for all of us, should help us understand the need for good leadership, for elders, but also for these things like word ministry and that selfless serving one another, which is important for everyone, because just as elders and leaders are to lead, others are to follow, which is to say that word ministry, the speaking truth to one another and the loving one another, is for all of us. And so that we should not read this passage and say that's just information for someone else, but to honestly try and understand what was Paul, and therefore what is Jesus' heart for his church. What do they really need? What are the dangers? And I hope that's helped. That will correct our understanding of the church, which is what we're hopefully learning throughout this book. And I hope it will lead to fruitful responding to it next week. So have a great study, and we'll see you on Sunday.